Gennadius II, Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople from 1454 to 1464, philosopher and theologian, was one of the last representatives of Byzantine learning, and a strong advocate of Aristotelian philosophy in the Eastern Church. Biography. Scholarius is believed to have been born as Georgios in Constantinople in c. 1400. His abecedary was Mark of Ephesus. Following his tutelage under the famous John Tasmanos, Manuel Mark might have then recommended him to study under his own previous master, Georgios Gemistus Plether, 1428. However, his studies under Plether are a matter of speculation and, at any rate, would have been more likely attendance at Pletho's lectures at Mistra. Scholarius had been a teacher of philosophy before entering the service of the Emperor John VIII Palaeologus as a theological advisor. In fact, in 1437, in anticipation of the Council of Ferrara, Florence, the emperor formally studied Nilus Cabasilus's works along with Mark of Ephesus and Gennadius Scholarius. Curiously, the trio also formally studied the works of John Duns Scotus because of his rejection of the filioque in Thomistic metaphysics, as well as Scotus' doctrine of a formal distinction between the persons and essence of God, as well as God's attributes. It was for this reason that Scholarius wrote an academic refutation of the first 18 of Mark of Ephesus, syllogistic chapters against the Latins. From this, we can surmise that Scholarius was likely writing an academic exercise to inform his former master that Thomas Aquinas' opinions did not constitute a universally Latin approach to questions on the Trinity. Council of Florence. Scholarius becomes historically important when, as judge in the civil courts under John VIII, he accompanied his emperor to the Council of Ferrara, Florence, held in 1438 to 1439 in Ferrara and Florence. The object of this endeavor was bringing a union between the Greek and Latin churches, which he supported at that time. He made 4 speeches at the council, all exceedingly conciliatory. At the same council appeared the celebrated Platonist, Gemistus Plether, the most powerful opponent of the then dominant Aristotelianism, and consequently an antagonist of Scholarius. In church matters, as in philosophy, the two were opposed. Plether advocated a partial return to Greek paganism in the form of a syncretic union between Christianity and Zoroastrianism, while Scholarius, more cautious, pressed the necessity for ecclesiastical union with Rome on doctrinal grounds, and was instrumental in drawing up a form which from its vagueness and ambiguity might be accepted by both parties. Scholarius was at a serious disadvantage because, being a layman, he could not directly take part in the discussions of the council. Returned to Constantinople. Despite his advocating the union, when he came back to Constantinople, like most of his countrymen, he changed his mind. This should not be exaggerated, however, since Scholarius abandoned the council early on and never signed its decree of union, at the behest of his mentor Mark of Ephesus, who converted him completely to anti-Latin orthodoxy, till his death. Scholarius was known as the most uncompromising enemy of the union. It was at just about this time that Scholarius began to draw attention to the putative heterodoxy of Aquinas' distinction of reason between the attributes and essence of God. First, as contained in Juggi's edition of his Opera Omnia, Scholarius interrupts chapters 94 to 96 of his Discourse on Being and Essence of Thomas Aquinas, and replaces the Thomistic explanation with that of Scotism in order to agree better with Palamas. However, he initially mitigates total condemnation of Aquinas, noting that later scholastics interpret Aquinas in a more orthodox light. This point marks Scholarius' increasing theological distance from Aquinas, where he begins to be more theologically condemnatory of him in later works. He then wrote many works to defend his new convictions. which differ so much from the earlier conciliatory ones that Alatius thought there must be two people of the same name, to whom Gibbon Renaud has restored the identity of his person, and the duplicity of his character. After the death of John VIII in 1448, Georgios entered the Pantocrator monastery in Constantinople under Constantine XI and took, according to the invariable custom, a new name, Gennadius. Before the fall of the city he was already well known as a bitter opponent of the Union. He and Mark of Ephesus were the leaders of the anti-Latin party. In 1444, Mark of Ephesus on his deathbed praised Gennadius's irreconcilable attitude towards the Latins and the Union. It was to Gennadius that the angry people went after seeing the Uniate services in the great church of Hagia Sophia. It is said that he hid himself, but left a notice on the door of his cell. "O unhappy Romans Byzantines, why have you forsaken the truth? Why do you not trust in God, instead of in the Italians? In losing your faith you will lose your city." Ottoman period. After the fall of Constantinople, Gennadius was taken prisoner by the Turks. In administering his new conquest, 21-year-old conquering Sultan Mehmed II wished to assure the loyalty of the Greek population and above all avoid them appealing to the West for liberation, potentially sparking a new round of crusades. Mehmed therefore sought the most anti-Western cleric he could find as a figure of unity for the Greeks under Turkish rule, and Gennadius as leading anti-Union figure was a natural choice. On the 1st of June 1453, just 3 days after the fall of the city, the new Patriarch's procession passed through the streets where Mehmed received Gennadius graciously and himself invested him with the signs of his office, the crozier and mantle. This ceremonial investiture would be repeated by all sultans and patriarchs thereafter. The city's famous patriarchal basilica, the Hagia Sophia, had already been converted into a mosque by the conquerors, so Gennadius established his seat at the Church of the Holy Apostles. The Ottomans divided their empire into millets or subject nations, of which the Greeks were the largest, known as the Rum millet. The Patriarch was appointed the official head or ethnic of the Greek millet, which was used as the Ottomans as a source for imperial administrators. Gennadius became a political authority as well as a religious one, as were all his successors under the Ottomans. As was normal when a monk or lay scholar was appointed patriarch, Gennadius was consecutively ordained, first as a deacon, then as a priest, then finally as a bishop before being appointed patriarch. In the spring of 1454 he was consecrated by the Metropolitan of Heracli Perinthus, but since both the Church of Hagia Sophia and the Palace of the Patriarch were now in the hands of the Ottomans, he took up his residence successively in 2 monasteries of the city. While holding the episcopal office, Gennadius drew up, apparently for the use of Mehmed, a confession or exposition of the Christian faith, which was translated into Turkish by Ahmed Qadi of Beria. Gennadius was unhappy as patriarch, and tried to abdicate his position at least twice. In 1456 he resigned. The full reason for this step commonly attributed to his disappointment at the Sultan's treatment of Christians, though Mehmed seems to have kept the fairly tolerant conditions he had allowed to them. Various writers hint darkly at other motives. Eventually, he found the tensions between the Greeks and the Ottomans overwhelming. There is no consensus among scholars about the exact dates of his last 2 patriarchates. According to Ximenes, he reigned again from April 1463 to c. June 1463 and from August 1464 to autumn 1465. Blanchet objects to the existence itself of these 2 additional terms. Gennadius then, like so many of his successors, ended his days as an ex-patriarch and a monk. He lived in the monastery of John the Baptist near Sarai in Macedonia, where he wrote books until he died in about 1473. Gennadius fills an important place in Byzantine history. He was the last of the old school of polemical writers and one of the greatest. Unlike most of his fellows, he had an intimate acquaintance with Latin controversial literature, especially with St. Thomas Aquinas and the scholastics. He was as skillful an opponent of Catholic theology as Mark of Ephesus, and a more learned one. His writings show him to be a student not only of Western philosophy but of controversy with Jews and Muslims, of the great Hesychast question. In short, of all the questions that were important in his time. He has another kind of importance as the first Patriarch of Constantinople under the Turks. From this point of view he stands at the head of a new period in the history of his church. The principles that regulated the condition of Orthodox Christians in the Turkish Empire are the result of Mehmed II's arrangement with him. Writings. About 100 to 120 of his alleged writings exist, some of which remain in manuscript, and some of which are of doubtful authenticity. As far as is known, his writings may be classified into philosophical and theological and ecclesiastical, in addition to numerous homilies, hymns, and letters. Gennadius was a prolific writer during all the periods of his life. The complete works of Gennadius were published in 8 volumes by Jugi, Petty and Siderides, 1928 to 1936. First period. The chief works of this time are the speeches made at the Council of Florence, also a number of letters addressed to various friends, bishops, and statesmen, mostly unedited. An apology for 5 chapters of the Council of Florence is doubtful. A history of the Council of Florence under his name is really identical with that of Syropoulos. Second period. A great number of polemical works against Latins were written in this time. 2 books about the procession of the Holy Ghost, another one against the insertion of the Filioque in the Creed, 2 books and a letter about purgatory, various sermons and speeches, a panegyric of Marcus Eugenicus, etc. Some translations of works of St. Thomas Aquinas, and polemical treatises against his theology by Gennadius are still unedited, as is also his work against the Balaamites. There are also various philosophical treatises, of which the chief is a defense of Aristotle against the Neoplatonist Gemistus Pletha. His most important work is easily his Confession, addressed to Mehmed II. It contains 20 articles, of which however only the first 12 are authentic. It was written in Greek. Ahmed Qadi of Beria translated it into Turkish. This is the first of the Orthodox symbolic books. It was published first by Brassicanus, and again by Chytraeus. Martin Crucius printed it in Greek, Latin, and Turkish in his Turco-Grecia. Rimmel reprinted it, I. 1-10, and Michalcescu in Greek only. There exists an arrangement of this confession in the form of a dialogue in which Mehmed asks questions and Gennadius gives suitable answers. This is called variously Gennadius's dialogue, or Confessio Prior, or Divia Salutis Humani. Rimmel prints it first, in Latin only, and thinks it was the source of the confession. It is more probably a later compilation made from the confession by someone else. It should be noticed that Gennadius's philosophy is in evidence in his confession during the 3rd period, from his resignation to his death. He continued writing theological and polemical works. An encyclical letter to all Christians in defense of his resignation is unedited, as are also a dialogue with 2 Turks about the divinity of Christ, and a work about the adoration of God. Jan has published a dialogue between a Christian and a Jew and a collection of prophecies about Christ gathered from the Old Testament. A treatise about our God, 1 and 3, against atheists and polytheists, is chiefly directed against the theory that the world may have been formed by chance. 5 books, about the foreknowledge and providence of God and a treatise on the manhood of Christ, are also in Patrologia Graeca, CLX. Lastly, there are many homilies by Gennadius, most of which exist in manuscript at Mount Athos. In popular media. In 2012 film, Veta 1453, Gennadius is played by Adnan Kurtlu.